Hi everyone, thank you for joining us again tonight. Unfortunately, again, we begin with a prayer and dedicate the learning here to those who are still in captive. And chapter 121, which is not in this booklet. On this. Okay, chapter 121. Shalom Alex. Esa ina el-arim me'ayin nabi Ezri azim im Adonai oisei shmayim ha'aretz. Ha'itein la'amrit raglecha yanu shem racha inni lo yanu la'ishon shem Yisrael Adonai shem racha and le'itzilcha yadim minecha yom Hashem ashla'ekeka v'yareach ba'alo la'adnei yishmorcha mikara yishmor es mashacha Adonai yishmor tzeis chaviyacha me'ata v'yad olam. And dedicate the learning here in their merit. Okay, so today we're actually going to find quite a bit of parallel between the story that's happening today that we're learning about tonight and the way in which Halacha progresses now today, which we'll talk a little bit about next week. So this week's going to be like almost a very similar pattern to what we're experiencing today in terms of the Halacha. So last week we left off with the Rishonim period. We call it the Rishonim, and we came to understanding where the Sephardim and Ashkenazi traditions and halacha split, essentially split by geography in Northern Europe and then in the Iberian Peninsula, the Rhineland versus Iberian Peninsula, and each taking from the Gaonic tradition, from those in Babylonia, applied the logic of halacha to their circumstances, and then different conclusions with different majorities came. Now, I'm not sure how well you remember the dates. Nobody remembers dates, but the dates in the Ashkenazic line that we spoke about last week went a little bit longer than the dates in the Sephardic line. We concluded the Ashkenazi with the Maharil, which is someone in the 1400s, died in the 1400s, which was, we noted he was a collector of Ashkenazic custom. And on the Sephardic side, we concluded with the Torah. The Torah being that first code that had 4 sections, whose father was the big rabbi who moved from Ashkenaz to Sfarad, and he consolidated based on 2 major Sephardic thinkers in the previous generations before him, Rambam and Rabbi Yitzchak Afasi, and his father, the Rosh, which meant that it was very much Sephardic bent, because 2 out of the 3 people he's relying on are Sephardic in nature, and his father lived in Sfarad as well, so there's a Sephardic bent to that. Now he lives in the 1500s, I don't have a date for it, but somewhere in the 1500s, earlier, in the 1300s. He lives in the 1300s, so it's quite a bit earlier than the line that we went in the Ashkenazic. Now this is significant to get to the next point of the story, because to demarcate when exactly was the end of the Rishonim period and the beginning of the Acharonim, Rishonim meaning the earlier ones we discussed last week, and the Acharonim, the latter ones that we're going to be discussing this week, what year do you put them in, and when do you make that switch is not exactly so clear cut. The most universal way of, just from historically, when you want to demarcate between one generation and another, it often happens when a big event happens. So in our lifetimes, in our generation, we think of pre-war and post-war, right? As 2 different generations, because the war changed everything, right? The Holocaust essentially changed everything for the Jewish world, for the world at large, and there's a pre-war world, and a post-war world. So in the end of the Rishonic period, the biggest event that would match that would be the expulsion from Spain, which is 1492. So that's often the line that would demarcate the pre-expulsion to post-expulsion. So with that in mind, let's move to the next, to page 1, and we'll talk about some of the major events that took place leading up to the expulsion, and then post-expulsion, which will kind of give us an idea of what Jews are going through during this entire time period, and it'll help us understand how Halacha got to where it is and why the Shulchan Aruch became so popular, and how things move forward. So we're going chronologically from left to right. So we're starting in Northwest Europe, and it's put rough years 1300 to 1500. You could go earlier to 1100s and go farther than 1500s, but we're looking at Northwest Europe, which was the region of Ashkenaz we talked about last week, Germany and France. It's Northwest Europe. And what we're looking at now specifically is how they slowly move toward Poland, which is toward the east. So throughout this entire period of time, there's mass pogroms and expulsions non-stop for the Ashkenazic Jews from all over. First from here, then from there, and then back to there. Sometimes they were thrown out of France, and then they were invited back in, and then thrown out a little while later, and then invited back in. Oftentimes, actually, almost comically when you think about it, because what would happen is Christians are not allowed to lend money to fellow Christians on interest. Jews can. Right? So Jews would often lend money to the landlords, to the local nobility, who needed to fund some sort of campaign of some sort, and then the interest racked up, and it was just cheaper to throw the Jews out than to pay them back. But then a little while later, you have another campaign, and you need to borrow more money. So you bring the Jews back so you can borrow money again. This would happen. Sorry about this. This would happen where Jews would have to be thrown out back and forth. And this happened for hundreds of years in the Ashkenazic countries. And because of that, slowly but surely, Jews started moving eastward toward the Poland Empire, which was much more accommodating and much nicer to the Jewish people at the time. And another event that kind of gives you an idea of how crazy it was for Jews in Ashkenaz at the time is, you've heard of the Black Plague, right, which is in 13-something, right? It kills, I don't know how many millions of Europeans, and whether this is factually true or not factually true, but it was believed that Jews died at a slower rate than their Christian counterparts. Sorry? It was understood as fact for a very long time, but apparently recently historians are questioning. But either way, it was certainly believed that Jews died at a slower rate. And the theory was because Jews, A, washed their hands for meals, so we'd be cleaner, and salted meat. That's another variation why we might have... Sorry? And we buried dead bodies very quickly.
They left their dead bodies in the hospital.
In wake. Jews don't. Jews bury right away, right? So, at any rate, because the Jews died, or at least were believed to have died at a slower rate than their Christian counterparts, the Christians actually believed that it was the Jews' fault, that the Black Plague happened. It was a Jewish conspiracy. So more Jews died in plagues after the Black Plague than in the Black Plague. That's how insane medieval Europe is for a Jew living in Christian lands in northwestern Europe, in Germany and France. Blamed for, of course, the blood libels you've heard of. Jews were blamed for stabbing. It's crazy, stabbing the wafers the Catholics eat, because it's the body of JC. So we want to kill JC, so they were officially stabbing these wafers for some reason, and they were blamed for that and murdered in the streets and pogroms. All kinds of wacky things were going on. So Jews are slowly moving toward the east, toward Poland. By the time the 1500, 1600, and then a little while later the Baal Shem Tov is around 1700, everybody's in what's today Ukraine, Poland, and Russia. Everybody starts moving that way. Okay, so that's one event that changes the Jewish landscape. It's not an event, but it's a series of events that move Jews out of where they are in Ashkenaz towards the east. The second event, of course, is 1492, this Spanish expulsion. I'm glossing over the story, but essentially, and this would explain maybe why the tour is where he is and why it's a little bit quieter afterwards. Because in 1391, I'm a little bit ignoring a lot what's going on in Spain, because in Spain, it's first under Christians, then under Muslims, then back under Christians, and back under Muslims, sometimes half under Christians, half under Muslims. And when I say Spain, I mean the whole of Andalusia, that is to say, the whole Iberian Peninsula, which is today's Spain and Portugal, with a bunch of little kingdoms. Sometimes this kingdom is under the Muslims, sometimes it's under Christians, sometimes under nice Christians, sometimes under not nice Christians, sometimes under nice Muslims, sometimes under not nice Muslims. All those changes are going on the whole time. But in 1391, a major event happens in which, for a variety of reasons, Jews are forced converted en masse throughout the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the forced conversions causes a very big problem for the church, because the church believes that if you're forced converted, you're still a convert. Which means if a Jew is forced converted and then the next day goes back home and lives like a Jew, this is a big problem for the Catholic Church. Right? And this is where a little while later the Inquisition starts. The Inquisition starts to to inquire as to whether what they called new Christians or conversos, meaning Jews who were forcibly converted to Christianity, whether they were actually living up to their Christianity that they officially converted to. And this is the whole idea of Jews hiding their Judaism and so on and so forth. So that's happening. 1391 is the forced conversion, and I think the Inquisition starts in 1450s. So it's almost a century later, but somewhere around 14 something, the Inquisition starts. Now in 1492, a fellow named Turk, what was his name? Turkmadan, that's right. That's him in the black. It's officially him in the black little coat there. He made the claim to King Ferdinand and Isabella, king and queen, that's sitting in the back. And this man here this is a depiction, it's a, it's not what they look like, but it's a, artist rendition. This is officially the Barbanel of Bravanel, one of the great Jewish scholars of the time, who actually was born in Portugal, moved to Spain, moved back to Portugal. Anyway, this fellow, we'll call him Haman, he convinced the king and queen that the reason why the new Christians, that is to say Jews who were forcibly converted to Christianity, the reason why they're not living out as true Christians is because they have Jewish neighbors. Which he was actually right about, because it's possible that in one family you have a bunch of people who somehow managed to avoid the forced conversions and another who didn't. So you have a generation later cousins who live on the same street. Half of them are officially Christians because their family was forced converted 30, 40 years ago, and the other half is going to shul. And they're still doing business together, and they're still sharing maybe a Pesach Seder together. So it's true that he was right, that what kept the conversos away from fully integrating with the Christians was the fact that they had Jewish neighbors. So therefore he said, if you want the new Christians to become real Christians, you got to throw out the actual Jews. So the Inquisition was against Jews who had converted, and the expulsion was against Jews who did not convert. And that also changed the landscape of Jewish life as well. Obviously, Jews are uprooted and they end up all over the place. And we'll look at a map in a second where they end up. So, I guess what we're looking at here is two major events. Two storylines, one that happens in Sfarad and one that happens in Spain, both of which send the Jews into other regions. Turn the Jews into refugees. In Ashkenaz, they're moving east towards Poland, and from Spain, they're leaving basically all over. To the Ottoman Empire, to all along the Mediterranean, basically all along the Mediterranean basin. So even some parts of south of Spain, like in Provence area, and then Italy, Greece, and Turkey, and Israel even, and then North Africa as well. Right? Some Spanish Jews go in a different direction. We'll talk about that in a minute. Right? And then Ashkenazim also being displaced as refugees. So there's a period of time when all Jews are basically refugees. And you can see the kind of parallel to our generation post-war, where in a very similar amount of time, all Ashkenazi Jews were displaced from Europe, and all Sephardic Jews were displaced from north, from all of their lands, being thrown out of all the Muslim lands that they had lived in for hundreds of years. So we're starting to kind of see a parallel already, where Jews are refugees for a whole generation, and the Halacha has to figure out how to deal with this. So there's a kind of a parallel that goes on. Okay, if we go a little further down, historically speaking, we're kind of fast forwarding, but this gives us an idea of the time period that we're going to be looking at. Is the third one here going from left to right, is the Chmielewski Revolt, which takes place in Poland/Ukraine. Now, I put this picture here because this is actually a statue that stands still today, unless the Russians bombed it, but it still stands today in Kiev. And this is the Chmielewski. He's a Ukrainian hero, celebrated until today. There's a square with this big, massive. Sorry? Chmielewski, I'm not sure I pronounce it. Chmielewski, I think it's Chmielewski. Yeah? He was a Ukrainian Cossack leader who essentially revolted against the Polish who had controlled Ukraine at the time. Now, for whatever reason, the Jews represented Poland, because the Jews, as they were in many of these time period, they were called tax farmers. Tax farmers meant that a king would want to tax a certain community instead of, again, we talked about last week, you don't have Social Security, so you're not being taxed individually, you're being taxed in a group. So the king would tell the Jews, or the king of Poland would tell the Jews, okay, you guys need to be in charge of collecting my taxes. Please go to that community and raise X, go to that community and raise X, go to that community and raise X. And then the Jew would raise a little bit more, and then that would be his earning. That's how he'd make a living. So if the king said, I want 10,000, I don't know, zloty, whatever the currency is from that state, the Jew would raise 11,000, and 1,000 would go to the Jewish income, and 10,000 to the king. So it's a delicate kind of job to be in. You have to do what the king says, because otherwise you'll lose your citizenship, you'll be thrown out. And at the same time, you don't want to be too burdensome on the people you're raising taxes from, because the king is somewhere out wherever, but you're the guy right next door collecting taxes. So if they get mad, they're getting mad at you. And that's essentially what happens. When Khmelnytsky revolts against the Polish, which is why he's a Ukrainian hero, because he throws away the Polish and he liberates Ukraine from the Polish overlords. But he does so by slaughtering thousands of Jews. By some estimates, 300,000 Jews were killed during this time period. So this is happening, this is what's known in Hebrew as Gzeras Tat V'Tat, the years Tavches and Tavtes, which are equivalent to 1648, 1649. This was a massive trauma for the Jewish people, and obviously Jews are displaced again. And likewise, at a similar time period in the Ottoman Empire, there's the Shabbat Tzvi story, which we spoke about a couple of weeks ago in the summer on Shabbos. Essentially a false messiah who, considering the tumultuous time Jews are living in here, was very successful in garnering a lot of support. Many Jews sold their belongings, moving toward Israel, thinking that the Messiah was here. Massive failure, and it was a huge blow to Jewish morale. And Sabbatean belief still persisted, as we learned on Shabbos, till the 1700s, until Rabbi Yaakov Emden put an end to that. But it still persisted for a very long time. So while you have materialistic persecution, you also have spiritual demoralization that happens in the same time period. Okay, so this kind of covers the major historical events that happen in the time period that we're looking at now. And essentially, it's first displacement, in both from Europe, both from Ashkenaz and from Spain, around the same time period where Jews are being displaced. And likewise, fast forwarding about 100 years, you have massive persecution of Jews, along with spiritual demoralization for Jews. This is the time period we're looking at. Okay, so here's a little bit of a map. It looks confusing, I'll simplify it. So you'll see a map of the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Or actually, movement of Jews, period, actually, not just from Spain, during this time period. So I didn't make the map. I found it online. I'm good, but not that good. So, if you look at the red on page, it's the third page. Look at all the words that are in red. So the Netherlands, Poland, Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and Maghreb. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Maghreb.
Sorry?
Maghreb.
Maghreb, that's how it's pronounced? Okay. It's the region of North Africa. So North Africa, Netherlands, Poland, Ottoman Empire, Egypt. That's where Jews are. Right? So the center of Europe they're being thrown out of, and they're moving to the east and then to the north, into North Africa. Right? Those are the red places that they go to. The black words and numbers are dates and places from which they were thrown out. See? That's the easiest way to look at it. Look at the red letters, that's where they end up. Poland, Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and North Africa, and Netherlands. So you see Netherlands has some Portugal Jews, but we're not going to really touch a lot about those. Most Ashkenazi Jews, as you see in these lines here, move towards Poland. Right, that's the region there. And most of the Sephardic Jews end up all across the Ottoman Empire. Starting from like here in northern Italy, all the way throughout Salonika, we learned about that. And on Shabbos, and Egypt, and North Africa, of course, is Morocco, Algeria, and so on. So Jews are majorly displaced throughout this time period.
Where's the Portugal Isle that goes to the sea?
To the Americas. Jews ended up in Peru and Mexico, and the Inquisition followed them there, actually.
Really?
1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Right, it's the same year as the expulsion.
Mm-hmm.
So Jews actually went to the Americas hoping for a new life, and they were met with the Inquisition there too. Really, until the 1800s. In Lima, Peru, in Mexico, because it was under Spanish rule.
Yeah.
It was called New Spain. Mexico was called New Spain then, right? So there was an Inquisition that went there too. There was a couple hundred Jews were burnt alive in Peru, I believe. That's a little while later. Yeah, so the Jews do end up in the Netherlands, but we're going to ignore that for right now. Okay, so that gives an idea of where Jews are, where they're going, and why this is such a crazy time for Jews, obviously. Okay, so that's element one, is the the fact that Jews are the refugees now again. That's element one that defines this time period. Another influence on halacha that's important for the period we're about to get into, for this time period, is the influence of Kabbalah. We've kind of ignored it till now. And the reason we ignored it is because although Kabbalistic learning existed, all the way back till Sinai, the same way halacha was learned, and in theory we could do the same series on like Kabbalah, take us down through the history of how we got to where we are. We do a Kabbalah/Jewish philosophy, and we have the same kind of storyline, moving from here to there, and then changing as it moved along. So Kabbalistic influence exists, but it starts to integrate into halacha at the same time period that the Shulchan Aruch is being written. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, as we'll learn, is written in the 1500s in Tzfat. At the same time, and part of the same group of people, is the Arizal. The Arizal and the author of the Code of Jewish Law co-sign on a number of halachic rulings even. They're friends. They're part of the same circle of ex-Spanish families who end up in Tzfas. And it's after the Arizal that Kabbalah starts to influence halacha, as we'll see. So we're backtracking a little bit to see how Kabbalah ended up at the Arizal. So simultaneously, both in Ashkenaz on the right and on the left, in Sfarad, Kabbalah is being learned and taught. And both of them, which is why I put these lines here, because both the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim got their traditions from the Gaonim. From the same way the Halacha came from Babylonia, so did the Kabbalah come from Babylonia. From Saadia Gaon was a teacher of Kabbalah and others, and then made it to Europe, to Spain, and to Ashkenaz. So in Ashkenaz, the Kabbalah was called Chasidei Ashkenaz. At the time, they were just called Hasidim, which means pious one. Today, they're called Chasidei Ashkenaz to differentiate between what we call Hasidim today. Right? So the Chasidei Ashkenaz are a group of people that lasted for about 200 years, 1170 to 1390. Germany and France. These are the most famous books of them. You may have heard of Rabbi Chassid, like for example, the idea of not living in a place where there was once, not destroying an oven. That comes from this group of people. Other customs we have, not to fully close the door, not to fully close the window, and other such customs that come from. That comes from Rabbi Chassid. That's in this time period. These Kabbalists that lived in Germany and France, and they would live a very ascetic lifestyle, very removed, very detached from materialism. That was their form of Kabbalah, which it kind of dissipated, but it still has its influence today. Now, simultaneously, in Sfarad, you also have the Kabbalah. So Ramban, who we didn't get to meet last week, but we met his student. Last week we spoke about the Rashba. This is his teacher, the Ramban, by Moshe ben Nachman. So you can see his times is 1195 to 1270. He was involved in a very famous public dispute with Christians. He basically set up. He was forced to debate, and the conclusion was foregone before he started, and he ended up leaving Spain and moved to Eretz Yisrael, which is where he died. The Ramban was a teacher of Kabbalah, so his students, in addition to learning halacha and writing halacha, as we talked about last week, they were also reading, learning, and writing Kabbalah. And he really popularized the Zohar. The Zohar, which was around since the giving of Sinai, was not made available to the public until around this time period. And the Ramban really popularized it by giving his stamp of approval on it and made it very popular. So at this time period, Sfarad is starting to learn a lot of Kabbalah. And a lot of the Spanish poets are part of this school of those who learned Kabbalah. And the Kabbalah of the Ramban, which is in Spain, so he passes away in 1270, and 200 years later, in 1492, when the Jews are expelled from Spain, the schools of Kabbalah still exist, and they bring it with them into the Ottoman Empire, the Arizal being a student of that Kabbalah. So the Arizal, this major exponent of Kabbalah and giving Kabbalistic customs, comes down to us from the Ramban, from the Sephardic tradition of Kabbalah. The Sephardic tradition of Kabbalah had received from the Gaonim itself, from Babylonia, and also, I made this arrow here, because a lot of the Ashkenazim, a lot of these Hasidei Ashkenazis, these Kabbalistic Ashkenazis, instead of moving toward Poland during the time when people are moving, some of them actually moved towards Spain, just like we learned last week, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who moved from Germany to Spain. Some of these Mukabalim also moved from Germany to Spain. So the Sephardic Kabbalah integrated the Ashkenazi Kabbalah and their own that they had received from Babylonia, and that made it down to the Arizal, which then makes it down to Chassidus, which is where we're going. Okay, so that's second important. Yeah.
Arizal's dates you have over there, I don't understand. Verse. Is it like he was?
Oh, sorry. Born 27, died 34. Yeah, sorry.
So he lived 20 years, like
36
6 years.
Very,
36,
7 years.
he lived very short life.
27 to 34.
36
No, okay, so I got the days are wrong. Look at the Hebrew side. Okay, I'm sorry.
36 years.
I'm sorry. The English side is wrong. He lived he's very short life. Yes.
36, 37.
5294, 5332. How many years is that? 36 years.
Yeah,
36, yeah.
And he was only active as a teacher for 2.
Oh, wow.
His teacher of Kabbalah, which was Ramosha Cordovero, passed away 2 years before he did, and it was those 2 years when the Arizal just basically non-stop spoke, and his student non-stop writing down. Chaim Vital.
So Sahari,
Yep.
36. Like
Lived a very, very short life, and yet very. The English dates here got messed up. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Just wanted to know.
It should probably say 1597, right?
But
Anyway.
from the Ramban till Arizal.
1592, actually. Sorry.
From the Ramban to the Arizal, you have 300 years.
Yes. So I'm only giving you the beginning of the school of Kabbalah and the end. But throughout the entire period, there are Kabbalah that are learning and teaching, and we have books from all those generations. And we can trace the line from Spain into Salonika, and then from Salonika into Tzfas. We can trace that line. Okay, so those are the two major things that are affecting the way Torah is learned and Halacha is spread. And number one is migration, Jews being displaced, and number two, the Kabbalistic influence. So what that does is that the next generation, and this is kind of the parallel we have today, when you're displaced, right? First of all, you need to have this word we keep on using, trans-geographic learning. So you're being moved all over the place. You have to be able to take your learning and your wisdom and your customs with you somewhere else. So whoever's going to come up with the most handy handbook that you can take with you is going to become the most popular, which is essentially what the Shulchan Aruch is. It's a small handbook that contains all this halacha that comes from the old country, which then would have been Spain, the new country being the Ottoman Empire for Sephardim. And the old country would have been the Rhineland for Ashkenazim, the new country being Poland, right? So they also have to have these scholars who will bring with them the wisdom and the tradition from the old country into the new country, right? Which is why, in this time period, the first thing here on the right is they're very involved in Piskei Dinim, making law, like point down law. What's Jewish practice, and specifically Manhagim B'frat, specifically customs. Because if you're a Spanish family that got kicked out of Spain, right, then you're somewhere in the middle of wherever. So you came from Catalonia, and you want to find the Catalonian shul that's gonna do Kabbalah Shabbos the way you did it back at home, right? And you have to start looking around for it, and you have to start finding it, and these little communities form that try to preserve their customs. And they're like, our customs are getting lost. Let's write it down because the next generation has to know the way we really did it, right? So people are constantly busy at this time with codifying what were the customs of what we used to do to preserve it for the next generation. I hope this is sounding familiar to the way we're doing, to what's happening today, right? What used to happen there? It's a very similar kind of parallel. So that's a very big component of the halachic writing at the time. And in many ways, that's what the Code of Jewish Law is. The Code of Jewish Law is, we'll talk more in a minute, but essentially that's what he's doing. His family came from Spain. He was actually a child. Yosef was a child, 4 or 5 years old when his family was thrown out of Spain. And he's collecting from his masters who he knew, who lived in the old country in Spain, and he's writing down, here's how we did it, here's how we do it. Right? It's in some ways what the Code of Jewish Law really is. Now the other two areas of major, is everything clear so far? Yeah? The other two major areas of halacha that are being dealt with at the time, not so much in the codes, but much more in the responsa. Right? There's halachic responsa that's still going on. People are sending questions and want to get answers. Two major subjects that come up is the question of agunos. Aguna is, I'm sure many of you are familiar, if a woman cannot get divorced because they don't know where her husband is. That's the way it used to be. Today it happens because of sociopaths, but where a woman can't get divorced. But in the old day, it was because the guy's missing. And when you have this kind of migration, especially if you fast forward to the Chmielnicki rebellion in 1648, the guys, who knows where, they ran this way, they ran that way, we have no idea where we are. You know, all kinds of wild stories that come up in the responsa where they try to send a message to find a Moshe ben Yosef, and they come to the town and they find 6 people who claim to be Moshe ben Yosef. So is this the husband? It's not the husband. Someone says, I saw Moshe ben Yosef who died. Is it the right one? Is it the wrong one? And can she get remarried? Can she not get remarried? It's a major discussion that goes on in the response of this time period, trying to help women identify who their husbands are and vice versa, so that they can move on with their lives to whatever degree. This is a painting. It's missing half the painting, so you can see there's a woman there distraught with 2 children, and she's sitting in front of the Dayanim, the Beth Din, and the Beth Din is actually looking to their right. And what they're looking at is a witness standing there, and they're trying to get from him, did you actually see this woman's husband? And can we track him down? Or maybe you know that he's dead, and therefore she can get remarried because he's no longer alive. Right? This was a big part of what they were dealing with at this time because of all the movement that was going around. Again, a similar thing happened after the Holocaust. The woman survived, and their husband survived, not survived. Where is he? How do we find him? Start running to registries and go to DP camps, and where are they? This was, again, an issue that came up. And really, every time there was war that involved Jews, it came up again. Another major issue that Jews are dealing with at this time is, so I put a little tree here for like a family tree. It's Yuchsin. Yuchsin is lineage. Because a Jew comes, when there's all those kinds of movement going around, and you had forced conversions going on all over the place, so it's hard to identify who's a Jew, who's not a Jew. Can you trust the guy? Was he forced to be converted, or maybe he actually really is converted, and now he's just coming here playing to be Jewish because he wants to get in business? And we do have stories of people who, when they came to this city, claimed they were Jewish, went to that city, said, hey, look, I'm Christian, I was baptized here, and there. And then they would show back somewhere else and say, oh, I'm really Jewish, I really didn't mean it. And
Are Jews found Jews because
right, but he did a wedding or he did a divorce. Is the divorce legitimate? Is it not legitimate? He's claiming this story. Is it legitimate? Is it not legitimate? Do we trust him? Not trust him? All these issues come up at this time period. Okay, so these are the major things. But most important for the story going forward is the one all the way to the right, which is the collection of Jewish custom and law, because you have to become trans-geographic. We're being displaced, so we have to have something we can carry with us and say, okay, here is the book that tells us what we do. Right? This is what the Mishnah was when they left from Israel to Babylonia. This is what the Gemara is when they go from Babylonia to Europe. And now that they're being displaced all over Europe, we have the Code of Jewish Law. That's essentially what happens. In many ways, Rambam was the same thing. Rambam was displaced from Spain himself way earlier, not in 1492, but he was displaced from Spain way earlier, and he wrote a code. And oftentimes in the code he says, I learned from my father that in Spain this is what they used to do. I'll write that in the code. So this is a very common thing where Jews are displaced, and you have to create trans-geographic halachic learning that we can pass on. Okay. Another major factor in Jewish, everything clear so far? Yep. Okay. Another major factor in Jewish learning at this time is the printing press. The printing press is invented somewhere in the early 1400s, and these are the dates I found online. The first Chumash is printed in 1474, and 10 years later the first printing of Talmud in a little place called Sansino, Italy, which is this little place on the left here. That's Sansino, and this is apparently the press that's still there in the museum, and this is the Sansino Chumash. I don't think it was printed in Sansino, but it's called the Sansino Chumash. I'm guessing they kept the name because of the history of Sansino being the first place where Jews printed their books. The printing press, you cannot understate the importance of the printing press for Jewish learning. If Jews were always the people of the book, and they would pay sometimes a lot of money to have someone transcribe word for word the entire Talmud for them, just to give you an idea, when the Talmud was burnt in France, we learned about this in the summer. What was it? 24 cartloads of Talmuds were burnt and 10,000 volumes. That's all handwritten. That's all handwritten. Imagine they had print. How many thousands of Talmuds they would be collecting. Think of Montreal. God forbid something like that happened. How many Talmuds they have to collect. Right? The print is a major factor in democratizing knowledge, and especially Torah, where Jews to begin with are thirsty for knowledge, and they're all looking for manuscripts and learning and reading and what do we do and how do we do it. The printing press becomes a huge important factor because it helps the transgeographic nature of Torah gets exponentially greater knowledge of the printing press. And the fact that at the same time period, or a little while later, the Code of Jewish Laws is published is not a coincidence in helping it become popular. Because someone can write a code in Tzfat, and very quickly, like that happens, it's printed all over Eastern Europe, where Jews are in Poland. Okay, so this is another factor of what's going on. So with all that in mind, taking into consideration the fact that Jews are displaced and the need is they're looking for trans-geographic learning, taking into consideration that they're moving from one place to another, so they're trying to, put down on paper, what did we believe, what did we do, how do we do things, combining that with the printing press, and the influence of Kabbalah, which Kabbalah brings along with it a nuance specifically in custom, not in necessarily law, but in custom, right? Do you wrap it film this way or that way? Sometimes it's Kabbalistically orientated. Do you wrap your Lulav Netzer this way or the other way? Sometimes, very often, Kabbalistic influence there. So not necessarily in the broad pictures of what Lulav Netzer is, but in the nuances of how you do something in custom, that will sometimes come from Kabbalistic influence. So bringing all that together, you have these two scholars. On the left, the Sephardim, on the right, Ashkenazim, Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserles. Live roughly the same time period. Right? Rabbi Yosef Karo passes away in 1575, and 2 years earlier, the Ramah passed away. Or 3 years earlier, Rabbi Moshe Isserles passed away 3 years earlier. One in Eretz Tzfas. Tzfas coming from Spain, as I mentioned. He was 4 or 5 years old and he was exiled from Spain. And Rabbi Moshe Isserles is in Poland. One of these families that have been displaced were moved from Western Europe, which is where Ashkenazim were, into Poland. Both of them had the same idea. Let's write a simplified code that anybody can carry around with them that has a basic practice of how you live as a Jew. Both of them had that same idea. Now, it just so happens that Rabbi Yosef Karo published it first. That's just what happened. He's also significantly older, lives a longer life. Maybe that plays a factor, I don't know. Anyway, these are officially pictures of them. I can't tell you, I can't verify the accuracy, but this is definitely Tzfat, and that's definitely Krakow, so those are real pictures. Okay, so let's unpack a little bit about how the actual Code of Jewish Law works, looking at their introductions. On page 7. So I'm just translating the Hebrew directly into English. So he says, this is the Shulchan Aruch speaking, Rabbi Yosef Karo, explaining why he's publishing this book called the Shulchan Aruch. So he says, it should be clear every law that can possibly ask of how you're supposed to practice. So that it's, shogar b'fiv means it's fluent in one's mouth, this entire book. Meaning he wanted it, actually this book, okay, you see it. And I divided it into 30 parts, so that every single day you learn one part, and therefore the result would be every month you would have completed the entire code. And that way, reading it every month, you basically memorize it. The Code of Jewish Law itself is very short, it's not so long. It's the commentaries on the side that make it bigger. But the code itself is not very long. And he divided it into 30-day learnings, and that way every 30 days you review it and you know the whole code by heart. So it's really like a trans-geographic effort. Whoever you are, doesn't matter what level of learning you are, it's very simple, straightforward Hebrew. Do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. Memorize it, and now you know what to do. Very good. Right? And he goes on to explain that this will be like a good reminder even for the scholars who want to have like quick notes on what's going on, and certainly for this beginner so that he can remember very well. Now, so this is what the Shulchan Aruch is trying to achieve. Now, as such, the Code of Jewish Law itself, the Shulchan Aruch, has no background or reasoning of how he came to his conclusion. That's not the point of the book. The point of the book is simplified, do, don't do, so that you can know very well and have quick reference and know it by heart. So for his back and forth as to how he came to those conclusions, he reserved that for other books he wrote. He wrote other books, which we'll talk about shortly, where he backs up his conclusions in the code. Right? Which is why, actually, there was some pushback from some of the scholars at the time saying that as nice as the Code of Jewish Law is, but no rabbi should you consult the code to give law. There were rabbis who said that at the time, because it's too simplified. Rabbi's going to open this book without knowing the background of how he came to this conclusion and just give a ruling? You got to know the background before you give a ruling. It's a very similar criticism that Maimonides got a couple hundred years earlier. But nonetheless, the code still persisted. Now on the right, you have the Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who's known as the Ramah, Reish Nam Aleph, Rabbi Moshe Isserles. his introduction to his code, if you will. So just to explain. The code of Jewish law is called Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch means set table. Because everything's set before you, all the laws are clear, you don't have to worry about it, it's all set before you. That's why it's called set table. Shulchan Aruch. Like at the Seder night, we have Shulchan Aruch, same thing, set table. Okay. So the Ramah, what he did was, he said, look, I wanted to do this job of making the simplified code. He beat me to it. Now the problem is, he's too heavily reliant on Sephardim. He's missing all of our custom. So instead of me writing a code that's just going to be a counter code, I'll just put a tablecloth to his set table. So he called his work the mappa, which is a tablecloth. And what he did is, he inserted anywhere in the code where Ashkenazim would differ from the Sephardim, he inserted a little gloss saying, you should know we do it differently. And that's what he writes in this thing here. The author of the code didn't leave anything behind him for anyone to do anything other than to collect our customs from our countries. Right? You see here, from the rule that this great genius did for himself to follow the Rif from Yosef Lafasi, the Rambam, when even the majority of halachic decisors are against the Rif and the Rambam. He followed Rif and Rambam because he's Sephardic biased. But we have our halachic rulers, the Tosafists, and the Margil, and all those people we talked about last week on the Ashkenazic side that are being ignored from the code. So I'm going to put a tablecloth on in which you have the Ashkenazic tradition. So ironically, actually, it's the Ramah who's critical of the code that popularizes the code. Because in some ways it took longer in Sfarad in the Sephardic communities, in the Sephardic diaspora, all throughout the Ottoman Empire. It took them longer to accept the code as the final ruling than the Ashkenazim. Because for the Sephardim, okay, this was one Sephardic rabbi who came from one particular region in Spain telling us the code. But we have our local rabbi who came from a different town. He came from wherever in Spain, and we come from wherever in Spain, which have a different custom. And we see that actually in the response at the time, where rabbis will say, look, that's Rabbi Yosef Karo's opinion, that's very nice, but the way we did it when we were in Spain was different. Right? Only sometime later did Rabbi Karo become like the clear halachic ruling for all Sepharad. But in Ashkenaz, it was accepted almost right away because of the Ramah's critique. Because he's coming as an Ashkenazic leader and saying, okay, the Sephardim, close, almost. Here's how you do it the way we do it. So the Ashkenazim said, okay, great, let's work with that. And all the Ashkenazic halachic writing afterwards all come as commentary on the code. So, funnily enough, there's more Ashkenazic commentary to the code than there is Sephardic commentary to the code, even though the code is originally Sephardic in nature. The Sephardic commentary to the code comes 100 years later in the 1700s. We'll talk about that next week a little bit. Right? So, if you imagine if Rabbi Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isilis, it's actually his humility that promoted him to another level. Because imagine he would write a separate code. Just an Ashkenazic code. So there would be no singular code that everybody would look at. There would be, whatever, this is the code written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, this is the code written by Rabbi Moshe Isilis, and there were other codes written at this time, like the Lavush, Rabbi Yafi wrote another code in Ashkenaz. Didn't become super popular. I mean, it's still learned, but it's not like the code. Because Rabbi Isilis had the humility to say, okay, he did a great job, I'm just going to tweak it a little bit. That's what made it popularized, because now you have two people representing two opposite traditions in one book, so of course this is the best book to go to. So it's his critique and his humility in not making a competition book that actually solidified the code as the de facto code. Because you'll find it in the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim, why not?
How far was Ramah in writing his code? Because I heard it was like fairly.
I don't know.
Yeah, I heard different opinions on how complete
Complete it was before he
released
wrote the gloss. I don't know. But he's quite strong in his critique of the Rabbi Yosef Karo being so reliant on solely Sephardic tradition. Like he relies very heavily on Rif Rambam. He follows the Torah, right? The Torah had his father, the Rosh, and Rif Rambam, and then took the majority, which was obviously going to be Sephardic bent, right? And the Shulchan Aruch followed that, right? And Ramah is looking at this and saying, oh, that's three people, Rif, Rambam, Rosh. But then we have all the Tosfos leaders, we have Rashi, we have Ibn Tam, we have Arizarua, we have Mordechai, and if we put them on a scale, we have like 6 here against 2 here. So why are we following this if you're going by majority, right? So this is where Rama's critique is on the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, is that clear so far?
So when it's printed now, so
Okay, so now I'll show you the next page. You'll see how it's printed. So just to answer that question on the right side, so this is what a typical page in the Code of Jewish Law looks like. The center text, that's the actual code. On the right is commentary, which we'll talk about in a minute. And in the orange box, you'll see the words there. It says, it's hard to see in there. It says Haga, which means gloss. And then there's words that are in different font than the main text. That's Ramah's glosses. That's their Moshe Isserlis's glosses. So that's a typical page of the Code of Jewish Law looks like. The body of the text, a little gloss where Ashkenazim do differently because of X, Y, Z, and then back to the main text. That's what a typical code looks like. Now on the left, we have a typical page of Torah. The center text here where I have the one pointing, that's the text of the Torah. We learned about him last week. The one who chose between the son of Rabbi the Rosh, who chose between his father Rambam and Rif. He made that first code a couple hundred years earlier. So this is his code in the middle there. And then the left, where it says 2, that says Bet Yosef. That's a Yosef Kairo's commentary to the Torah, in which he backs up his positions in the code. And likewise, number 3, there's a little thing there that says Darchei Moshe. That's Rabbi Moshe Isserlis's critique of the Beit Yosef and backs up his rulings in his gloss on the code. So when you learn today Halacha, you have to open these two books side by side. You open up first the Torah, see the conclusion he comes to based on Rif, Rambam, Rashba, the people we spoke about last week, and then you read the Beit Yosef, which gives you the whole background of how the Torah got there and why he's taking it to the next level in his code, and then you read Darkei Moshe, and then you can open up the Code of Jewish Law and see that's why they differ. Okay, this is the process of halacha learning till this very day, really. So I'm hoping a little bit that when you see all this history and why we're looking at these books specifically, is because it contains in it all of that history, going back to the Gaoni period, back to the Babylonian period, back to Sinai, essentially. Okay, so far clear? Okay, so we're going to close off with looking at 3 of the many major halachic commentators to the code. As I mentioned before, the majority of commentators on the code are actually Ashkenazic in nature. It seems to me, I could be wrong, it seems to me that the code became more quickly popular in Ashkenaz and Poland than it did in the Ottoman Empire. Although, as we'll see next week, the code does become extremely popular in the Ottoman Empire to the point that today, like Rabbi Vaji Yosef, who's a major halachic authority in the Sephardic world, he's like, Code of Jewish Law, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, that's it. That's the be-all, end-all for him. No moving away from that. That's the way Sephardim would go today, but it took time till it got there. The Ashkenazim kept on packing on to the Shulchan Aruch. So in the same way, Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, added his glosses to update the Shulchan Aruch for Ashkenazic custom, you'll have other Ashkenazic thinkers who will add not to the actual code itself, but they'll put commentary on the margin of the codes to further update it, including specific customs, including Kabbalistic influences, including other things that maybe they felt Ramah missed or whatnot. They're added to the margins of the codes. If you go back to the previous page, you could see them in their right box there, which is the Code of Jewish Law. On the right side, you'll see the Magen Avraham. That's one commentary, which is actually heavily Kabbalistically influenced and who influenced the thinking of the Alter Rebbe, who we'll talk about next week. And on the left is the Taz, Torei Zav. And then there's more which are cut out, but there's many more. So 3 of the major ones here is Rabbi David Levi Segal. You can see his dates there. This is the Taz, major halachic thinker who wrote commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. The Shach. The Shach is an abbreviation for Sifsei Kohen. Rabbi Shabtai Kohen. He was eventually in Vilna. He actually lived through the Chmielewski pogroms. He wrote a book called Sefer Uf or something like that. Something like The Flying Book. There's something that's the name of the book. And it's like a memoir of some sort of how the troubles of him going through the Chmielewski pogroms. A lot of the he wrote a lot of like liturgical poems, kimnas, that commemorate the events of that time period, and we still read some of them until today. So he's a major commentator on the code printed on the side. And finally, we have Avram Abele Gombiner, named for the town that he came from, who eventually became a rabbi in Kalisz, Poland, wrote a commentary called the Magen Avram, and he's the one that introduced onto the page, for the most strongly introduced onto the page of Halacha, Kabbalistic custom. Till this point, it was kind of kept separate. There's the code of Jewish law, and then there's the Kabbalists who have their way of doing things. But he puts it onto the page. He'll quote the Zohar on a page of code and say, according to the custom of the code of the Zohar, you should do it in such fashion. According to the Arizal, you should do it in such fashion. And he, to a very large degree, collecting from the Arizal tradition, as well as Hasidei Ashkenaz, the earlier Ashkenazic Kabbalists who we mentioned at the beginning, is what influenced, to a very large degree, Hasidic practice till this very day. As we'll learn next week, the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law relies heavily on Rabbi Avram Abele, this Magen Avram, as well as other Hasidic circles who rely heavily on the Alter Rebbe as well. So that kind of brings us to where we're going to go, God willing, next week. And I hope we're getting a sense of how Halacha evolves, and how when we talk about, when someone said, well, the Code of Jewish Law says X, it's not just one guy's opinion. This is thousands of years of learning that get condensed and brought down and passed through, that finally make it into a book that we can then handle. So the Code of Jewish Law is not like it's a blessing of Hashem. And the same with the Mishnah was, God blessed us with this Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, who then condensed all the tradition into a few books that helped us then learn forward. The Shulchan Aruch is the same way. The Code of Jewish Law is the same thing. And every time Jews get displaced, this happens again. When Jews get displaced, then we have to, so what are the practices we're keeping going? What we used to do and how we're going to keep this going forward? And as we're going to learn next week, a very similar thing happens till this very day. So I'm looking forward to seeing anybody. Any questions before we close? There? Okay. So God willing, next week, we're going to cover 3 major schools, like the non-Hasidic Lithuanian, the Hasidic, and the Sephardic tradition in the 1700s. We're going to bring ourselves up to basically till the war. Essentially, we're going to leave the post-war era maybe for another time. We're going to bring ourselves up to basically till the war, of where Halacha is, and kind of where today, collecting from what they did before the war. That's God willing what we'll do next week. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
And,